I put together a recovery timeline that illustrates the specifics and timing of how I recovered from my chronic back pain thanks to Dr. Sarno's book. And I thought that back then when I was going through the process that something like this might have been helpful to me just to have an idea of what to expect during the recovery process. And so I put it together and hope that it could help other people out there. So jumping in, I put together a little chart where on the vertical axis I show a little back pain meter that sort of indicated the severity of my pain at any given time. And 100% back pain severity in this case would correspond to the day before I read Dr. Sarno's book, and that was pretty much when the pain was at its most severe over the 7 years. Now, to give a sort of a status summary of what happened that day before finding Dr. Sarno's book, I had, as I mentioned in my previous videos, this sort of constant debilitating piriformis pain. And if you recall by piriformis, what I mean is that my butt muscle, specifically on my left butt area, would always have this sort of soreness that would happen, when I was sitting or walking, and the only way I could really relieve it was by sort of lying down. And along with this piriformis pain, I also had a very stiff lower back, which I had attributed to sort of L4-5 disc herniation due to the results of the MRIs. And to combat these types of pain back then, I was doing things like yoga every day, like I mentioned, and I also went swimming pretty often. Probably every other day or so, I would go to the swimming pool and go swimming. Like I mentioned before, neither of these things really um, solved the problem in the end, but they did sort of help to uh, temporarily relieve some of the pain, and also I always felt that it was good to keep moving no matter what, to do some exercises, even though I would shy away from certain more strenuous exercises like running, for example. And the day before, I recall reading Dr. Sarno's book, finding Dr. Sarno's book, I was actually scheduled to go have something called a piriformis injection the following week. And what that would have involved was sort of putting some kind of a local anesthetic, injecting that anesthetic into my piriformis muscle using some kind of guided X-ray fluoroscopy technique. And the hope was that by doing so, we could maybe numb the piriformis pain for maybe a couple months, and also to see whether the pain was in fact piriformis pain, because up till that point it had been sort of my speculation that the area that was hurting was actually the piriformis. And so I had been all ready to go into the doctors and to have this injection done, but the thing that sort of scared me was that it was a rather invasive procedure, in that they would have to stick a long needle, I guess, into my butt muscle, and I was not really looking forward to that prospect. And so therefore I was sort of searching online for answers and perhaps other ways to address the issue, address the problem besides having the injection. So on day one, which is the evening that I read about Dr. Sarno's book online from the Internet Bulletin Board. And I recall that that was a Thursday evening when I first came across the mention of his book. And immediately after reading about the book online, I remember I went on YouTube and looked up Dr. Sarno's name and I happened to find a testimonial done by Howard Stern on his radio show that actually, was very enthusiastic in recommending um, Dr. Sarno's book. And so when I listened to what he said, I thought it was really interesting and that I was really ready to give it a try. And so that same night, I went on Amazon and ordered not only the Healing Back Pain book, but several other of his books I remember, so that they could be delivered to me over the next few days. Now, at this point, the pain, looking at the chart, you'll see that the pain was actually, it didn't change from the day before to the day of finding out about Dr. Sarno's book. Now, on day 2, I think is the first was the first time that I actually found something interesting, that I actually experienced something interesting. Is that if you look at the way I've drawn the graph, on day 2, I actually experienced a sort of a slight dip in the pain. The day following finding out about Dr. Sarno's book. And I would describe that as a sort of because usually I would have the pain, it would just be sort of a very tight muscle. And I recall that the next morning after finding out about, after listening to Howard Stern and after finding out about this whole idea that the pain could be psychologically induced, I actually felt that the pain would it was still painful, but for some strange reason, it would sort of come and go in a very sort of high frequency fashion, in a very rapid way. And at the time, I thought that, it must not have been very significant. It must have been just sort of a fluke. But in retrospect, I realized that sort of a fluttering or a minor twitching of the pain back then was the first time that I had ever experienced anything like that with my piriformis pain, and that the pain would be there when I was standing, and it would just sort of disappear all of a sudden, and then it would come back. But this would happen in a very, very rapid fashion, such that I wasn't sure whether, I was, actually sure of what was going on, whether that actually was anything significant. And so at the time, I didn't really think much about it, but in retrospect, I do believe that that was sort of the first sign that something was being affected by my learning, acquiring the information about Dr. Sarno's book. And an analogy that I can think of now in describing what that feeling was on this day 2 that I am talking about here is that, how in these certain kind of maybe sci-fi movies like The Matrix or something, where you look at something that appears to be a reality, like, you see an image of a person in front of you who you think is real, and all of a sudden that image of that person, for example, starts to flicker, and it sort of comes in and comes out intermittently, and all of a sudden it really sort of jolts you because you realize, this thing that I thought was real perhaps was not real after all. And that was almost exactly the same feeling that I got with my piriformis pain on this day 2, which I refer to here as minor twitching, is that it sort of flickered in and out, and I was really confused. I was like, wow, this pain that I thought had been real, like a structural pain all along, it sort of just flickered in and out, and I was surprised, but also a little bit excited. But at this point, I wasn't really 100% convinced, and I didn't want to allow myself to get too carried away with overenthusiasm before I could see more concrete results. And so to continue, another thing I did on Friday is to go to Barnes & Noble, the local bookstore, and to just buy a copy of Healing Back Pain. And now, luckily, they had the book in stock, and so I was able to pick it up right away, even though, as I mentioned, I had ordered the book online, and it was scheduled to be delivered to me a couple days later. So I actually bought the book from Barnes & Noble, and I immediately started reading it later that afternoon. And I actually got through half of the book that night. And one thing that I did before the evening that day, I remember, was to cancel my piriformis injection for the following week, partly due to having found Dr. Sarno's ideas sort of very intriguing, and the other half simply being that I was not really comfortable at that point with going through with the whole injection, simply because I thought it was rather invasive. And so I thought that I should give Dr. Sarno's book and his technique sort of the benefit of the doubt, and to wait a little bit more before actually going through with the injection. So on day 3, I think was the day, this was a Saturday, and I remember that this was the day that I actually did I did work in the morning all the time, all morning. I didn't have the piriformis pain. And that was rather surprising to me, but there were times over the course of the 7 years when I would similarly be able to do work for maybe an hour or two without experiencing the pain. So at this point, I was sort of optimistic, but I was not yet entirely convinced. But what really made a big difference for me, as I mentioned in my previous video, was when I went jogging for the first time. And this was due entirely to Dr. Sarno's book having said that, it would be a good idea to resume jogging and any physical activity that you previously had thought was too strenuous for your back. And so I remember that afternoon, that Saturday afternoon, I went jogging and I experienced that strange shift of the pain where it used to be the left and then all of a sudden it appeared in the right. And that was sort of my first very convincing evidence that Dr. Sarno was really onto something. And I can say that what you're seeing here in terms of this back pain meter, it's almost sort of my belief. It's almost a reflection, a sort of a exact reflection of my belief that the pain was structural. So, starting from day one, I thought 100% for sure that this pain was structural. But after having read the book and after having experienced this sort of shifting of the symptoms, I slowly, gradually started to become more and more convinced that uh, the pain was in fact psychological. And so that's sort of the cool thing I realized is that this back pain meter, which quantifies sort of I thought a physical quantity of how much the pain actually physically manifested itself, was actually a direct analog to my sort of mental belief in whether this was a physical problem or not. So it was a sort of a one-to-one correspondence here on this vertical scale, which I thought, in retrospect was rather interesting. Now, going on to day 4, that was a Sunday, and I remember on this day I was doing work again in the morning, and this time I remember very clearly that the pain appeared again. That I think I got through maybe an hour or so, and I started to feel my left piriformis pain again, and I was sort of a little bit disappointed, as you can imagine, but I sort of kept working through the pain. And one additional thing that I did that day was to roll up the yoga mat, as I had mentioned earlier, and just stow it away, um, sort of hoping that in the future I would entirely adopt a sort of a mental approach to solving the problem um, rather than attempt to go take physical steps. And so I remember I rolled up the yoga mat and stowed it away that day. Now, day 5 was another sort of very important day for me, I remember, in that on that morning, on the Monday morning, I remember I was doing work and the pain did return. But I was sort of going through my mind and trying to figure out sort of a psychological basis for the pain now, which I had never done before. And I remember having a conversation with my friend that day, where I made a very specific remark that sort of had it had a very interesting impact on the pain. And I remarked to my friend that, this is strange because on Saturday I was doing work and there was no pain. And the pain came back on Sunday. And it was as if the pain knew that the day after Sunday, Monday, would be a work day. And because, when I'm doing work, it's usually a more stressful day, like on the weekdays when I get clients calling me and, I have to run around and it just gets busier on the work day rather than on the weekend. It was as if the back pain actually knew that on Sunday, the following day would be a work day, but on Saturday, the following day, which is Sunday, would actually be a holiday. And so it actually it actually knew that the stress would be happening on a certain day. And so I remember that when I made this remark, I thought that it was a very insightful thing that I had realized at the time. But the other important thing was that I could immediately feel that the piriformis pain at that point disappeared in a very large chunk. And I remember thinking that, wow, this was very amazing, indeed, because just by making that remark and just by having come to that realization psychologically, it was the first time that I actually realized, wow, that actually resolved the pain. And for the rest of the day, I remember I had no further pain. And so that was also another very important step for me to convincing myself of the fact that Dr. Sarno's techniques were actually legitimate. And so starting that day, I remember I started to regularly reread the book periodically whenever I could. So, reading through it once was not enough. I would just keep going back and reading it, and doing this would reaffirm my belief that, all of this pain could be addressed simply by educating myself and by using psychological uh, techniques rather than, going out to do physical exercise to address the pain. So by day 6, the piriformis pain which was much reduced. And I remember on that evening, I actually drove to the beach, which was about 45 minutes from my house. And I drove there and I drove back that night just to sort of build my confidence in a way. Because the fact is that I had strenuously avoided driving over these 6 years, and I would never drive anywhere for, if I anticipated that it would be longer than 45 minutes, I would always make other plans. I would always either find somebody to drive me, or I would simply not go, or I would, if I had to drive it, if I had to drive the distance, then I would sort of make sure that there was a place for me to lie down before going. So basically, the whole idea is that I treated this task of driving very seriously. But on day 6, on that evening, I remember I drove and I went to the beach and came back, and the pain was nowhere near as much as I had feared. I think at this point I could still feel the muscle was sort of aching a little bit, but it was much, much less already than, for example, the day before coming across Dr. Sarno's book. And so this built further confidence in in my belief that he was correct. So starting day 7, which is about a week in now, you can see that the pain was by this time about 50% gone. And by 50% gone, I would say that this means that, number one, the severity of the pain decreased significantly, in that it would not hurt as much as it did before. So every now and then there would still be sort of a slight aching, but it was no longer as sharp as it was before. And another thing was that it would appear much less frequently. So before, it would basically show up every day, but by day 7, I would say that it showed up maybe, you know, at the end of the day for a very short period of time, like maybe like the hour before going to bed. I might be able to feel the left piriformis pain, but as I said, the severity was not very, very great by that time. Now, there were two tactics that I sort of developed by day 7, which I wanted to share, and that is, if you recall, one thing that I learned to do after reading Dr. Sarno's book was to consciously try to bring into my mind the stressful issues that might have been in my life, which I was running away from. And I had found that doing so would reduce the pain by a lot if simply I engaged in this sort of mental exercise. Now, granted that technique, just that one technique, did resolve a lot of my pain, I noticed that there were certain times when, even though I was going through all of the stressful issues, that there would still be some residual pain. That it wouldn't actually solve the pain 100% just by by thinking about the stressful issues. And so I remember reading in Dr. Sarno's book that he had mentioned that there's another possible psychological cause besides stress, and that is the idea of conditioning. In that, for me, I had been conditioned to think that sitting in the chair for maybe an hour or two, anything more than 2 hours, would automatically bring on the piriformis pain, as well as engaging in other activities, for example, standing for a long time or walking. And I recall that in those instances where thinking about the stress was not enough to get rid of all my pain, then I would immediately resort to the next tactic, which was to realize that, okay, is there some kind of conditioning going on where it's probably there's probably pain simply because I've been conditioned to expect pain after sitting for 2 or 3 hours. And that was actually pretty helpful too, in that between these two tactics, exercising these two tactics consistently, whenever I felt the butt pain, that would actually cause a lot of the pain to be reduced um, pretty consistently. And so I sort of adopted these two habits over the course of my recovery, and they really helped me to reduce the pain. And so by day 15 now, which is about 2 weeks later, I noticed that the piriformis pain was really under control at this point, in that I didn't have to consciously exercise those two tactics that I talked about in the previous slide anymore. I was actually I felt like my mind had sort of adopted the correct pathway to not start, tightening the piriformis muscle every time, I had these issues psychologically. And so by the second week, I feel like it was sort of on an autopilot where I didn't actually have to go through as strenuously the psychological exercises anymore, and the pain was already being reduced. So I didn't have to actually consciously go through those things as frequently by this time. Now, there was another thing that I talked about earlier, which is that the back pain, which corresponded to the L4-5 disc herniation, which had actually shown up on the MRIs, this pain was actually it wasn't as sensitive to the psychological exercises as was the piriformis pain, the butt pain. But I did notice that over the course of the 2 weeks when the piriformis pain became drastically reduced, that this had a sort of a reduction effect. It clearly had a reduction effect also on the L4-5 back pain, so that while the reduction in L4-5 back pain was not as dramatic as the piriformis pain, but I could feel that it was also getting better as a result of me having addressed the piriformis pain effectively. And so by the second week, I could say that it no longer felt like the L4-5 disc vertebra was being twisted. It was more of a feeling like just sort of a bulging feeling in the back, in my lower back area. For example, when I was lying down to sleep at night, I could still feel that there was a slight bulge in the back area, but it was no longer the sort of debilitating twisting pain that I had talked about earlier that had caused me to frantically seek help prior to reading Dr. Sarno's book. And so I think from that point on, from the second week on, I was at the point where the piriformis pain was greatly under control, and the L4-5 back pain was slowly but surely improving. And so by day 22 now, which is the third week, end of the third week, I could occasionally still feel the piriformis, but now it would never be much longer than, say, 20 minutes. And also I could notice that there was a marked improvement in my bulging disc pain by this time. Now, I think one important thing also that I wanted to mention was that by this time I was pretty strenuously engaging in all sorts of activity that I had not been doing before, which as I had mentioned, I would be afraid to sit or drive for a long time or go running or play basketball, these kind of things. But by this time, by the third week, I was getting pretty used to doing those activities in my life again. And you cannot imagine how refreshing a feeling it was to start doing these activities again. Uh, I would describe it as sort of, because the back pain lasted 7 years. I would describe the feeling as having unaged 7 years. So I actually felt 7 years younger, after having solved the back pain problem, just by the fact that I was able to re-engage in all of the exercises, physical exercises, strenuous activity that I had been doing previously. And I noticed that there was really a strong psychological component um, to the back pain, not just in the way that Dr. Sarno described in his book, but it's a sort of it really affected over the course of the 7 years. My outlook on the world was really affected in that what I viewed as my possibilities in life were severely restricted by just the fear that the back pain would sort of appear at any moment. And so, for example, for over the 7 years, I had started traveling a lot less. I, you know, I was afraid to drive, and therefore, where I could go was sort of severely restricted in many ways too. And so, after having cured myself using Dr. Sarno's techniques, it was as if my whole outlook on life had had changed and sort of become young again by 7 years. And I thought that was a pretty remarkable thing. Moving on now to the third month after reading Dr. Sarno's book, which is actually pretty similar to the situation now for me, which is about 5 or 6 months after reading his book, is that every now and then the piriformis pain would still appear, but usually it's much less severe in intensity. And it usually lasts no more than 15 to 20 minutes. And the key difference now in how I deal with the pain is that I never do anything to pamper the pain. So if I feel that there is some pain in the left piriformis, then I would never, you know, lie down or do anything basically that sort of feeds back into uh, trying to physically make the pain go away. I sort of liken it now to, how sometimes if you get a mosquito bite on your skin, then you don't, go freak out and, do a lot of things to try to address the mosquito bite, unless it were, actually a really serious problem. But in most cases, every time you get a mosquito bite, yeah, you go, okay, well, big deal. And then you just sort of let it go, and then eventually it just resolves itself. So that's sort of the nature of my sort of piriformis pain now, is that it still appears sometimes, maybe once every, week or 2 weeks, in just a little bit. And the big difference is my attitude in dealing with it, is that um, I never pamper it like I've written here. And the other thing is that I would never plan or not plan to do something simply because uh, I'm expecting that I would have piriformis pain or back pain. So, for example, I would plan a long trip, and the trip might include lots of driving and long plane trips, things like that. So I don't let the pain ever stop me from doing anything that I otherwise want to do. And as I recall, that's one definition of recovery that was put forth by Dr. Sarno in his book, is that you can consider yourself 100% recovered when you no longer fear